Good morning, and welcome to the penultimate lecture on our study of the history of theology and humor. Today we go back to the 18th century and we find novelist Daniel Defoe. Daniel Defoe, as you may remember, was the author of Robinson Crusoe. Now there's not much humor of a man living alone on an island until even Friday comes. Even then, he's not laughing too much. But Daniel Defoe took us next to the idea that you don't have to live alone. Hollywood could take this whole idea and create a Survivor series. Daniel, we like the concept, but we thought you might have a few more celebrities, all who want to get off. So Daniel can be made fun of, but Daniel still had a sense of humor. Where we see that next is in all of the pamphlets that he wrote. He was a prolific writer. He had 3 marriageable daughters who at home, and he had to find husbands for them. So he wrote a pamphlet on religious courtship, being historical discourses on the necessity of marrying religious husbands and wives only. And so he was quite a character. He also wrote pamphlets in which he tried to laugh popery or Roman Catholicism out of doors. But the pamphlet that we see next is the most important one because he gets to his satire. And this satire is the shortest way to deal with dissenters. Now, he too was a dissenter, but he wrote in this little pamphlet, the poor Church of England, okay, the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church of the United States. What with popery on one hand and schismatics, independents, dissenters on the other, how has she been crucified between 2 thieves? And so he's really mocking this Anglican Church that sees itself as the crucified one. And so this high church hoax was very much like Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, because he says the best way to suppress nonconformity and dissenters is to exterminate them. That wasn't a legitimate way to deal with them, but still he got in trouble. So what we see next is that he had to defend himself very quickly because he was going to be put into the stocks, into the pillory. And so he wrote a true hymn to the pillory of the true born Englishman upon his standing in the pillory on the 31st of July, which is where he was sent. Now, what we see in this document next is that Defoe is arguing that people in the pillories should be primarily the drunken priest who turns the gospel into a bawdy jest, or the lewder clergy, the sons of God who every day go in, both to the daughters and the wives of men, and to those who would build up Rome, Roman Catholicism, to pull down Babylon, England, and the real authors of the shortest way, who for destruction, not conversion, pray. So he was trying to improve not only the Church of England, but the dissenters, and he was praying for that. Now, what happened was they put him next in this pillory, the glorious pillory of Daniel Defoe. And instead of people coming and throwing rocks or rotten vegetables at him, people came and threw flower petals at him, fresh flowers, and they loved him. I mean, he became a hero in the stocks. And so he was taken out of the stocks, he was released. Next, he begins to kind of teach on all of these other things that he sees. It's kind of a polymath in many ways, not only a writer of novels. And he wrote about a system of magic or a history of the black art. He said, now this is not a book, an instruction for beginners, but it's really to try to understand what people are doing when they practice this magic. His novel that came next, however, was one of the most ribald ones. And it was a confession. It made fun of people who would sin and repent and sin and repent. And it deals with the fortunes and the misfortunes of Moll Flanders. And so you have this spiritual biography with very shallow repentance that he is really holding a mirror up to society. Next, he wrote The Political History of the Devil as a kind of a personal friend, not really. But he had this great observation. He said, wherever God erects a house of prayer, the devil always builds a chapel there. And it will be found upon examination that the latter has the largest congregation. And so comparing the Church of England and the dissenters, he says there are dangers that people come and are misusing and abusing religion. Now, next we find that there are people who are very different, and they do not have a sense of humor. One in particular is Lord Chesterfield, a very aristocratic, genteel tradition. It's more about respectability. And he has this kind of sullen legalism or Puritanism without the vibrant faith of the Puritans. In fact, in 1748, he wrote to his son saying that frequent and loud laughter is the characteristic of folly and ill manners. It is the manner in which the mob express their silly joy at silly things. And he warned his son, a son may smile often, but should never to laugh while you live. Because he said you have to watch out for that shocking distortion of the face in laughter. And so he tried to reform manners. Manners was more important to him than faith. Even we find next that he says, you must learn to dance, but don't laugh. Don't show that you are enjoying yourself and becoming a commoner. Now, what this led to next was a whole series of visual satires. In the Reformation, we saw the woodcut wars in which the Roman Catholics and the Lutherans would make fun of each other through visual art. And so here in the late 18th and early 19th century, we have these wonderful caricatures that come up. And this one by Master George Woodward basically shows the development of a poor, thin curate or cleric, a small seminarian, as you were, who has nothing and has to learn how to bow, how to be obsequious and fawning before those that are better. But little by little, he becomes the vicar and the rector, and then he becomes a bishop. And at the end, we find that he has become an Anglican bishop who is fat and greasy and has all the power and has to sit because he is so overweight. Now, next we find there's another cartoon character, probably the first ongoing cartoon series in the 19th century, and this is Dr. Syntax. And so you get the play of words of kind of taxing sin. And he's a scrawny and eccentric elderly clergyman, and also kind of a schoolmaster like Ichabod Crane. His popularity even produced some tie-in merchandise that you could get. He was the creation of a very prolific and mixed British artist, Thomas Rowlandson. Now we find next that Dr. Syntax, in the kind of series of cartoons by Rowlandson, even tries to find direction for his life and looks at a crossword where signs are pointing in every direction. Unfortunately, what he doesn't see is a bunch of mules in the background, which is what he has become. He is taking things so literally, he doesn't really know the Spirit of God. Next, we have The Doctor's Dream. And there are several of these kind of comic series. This one is called The Tour of the Dr. Syntax in Search of the Picaresque. And the picaresque are things that are lovely to think about. It's again this Lord Chesterfield's genteel religion, where everything is nice and lovely and beautifully and privileged. And so he has to sit in the library and hope for some great ideas would come fluttering down from the books and by process of osmosis come into his mind. But next we find that he sits before audiences and he will read about his tour. Now, there's nothing so arrogant and so boring as an author reading his own works, and yet it happens everywhere. And so here is poor Syntax sitting by a fire where people are holding their head, others are drinking, others are falling asleep, and then a couple are fiddling in the background. It's kind of a wonderful kind of satire on the fact that ministers think that people want to hear their sermons. Now, next we get to a whole other series of visual satires. And in this one, it is the fat pluralist who accepts everything. Think of the kind of very wealthy, well-fed Episcopalian of the day who sits in his carriage and is pulled around by all the lean curates, all these kind of poor little seminary types. And he's trampling on the 39 articles of the Book of Common Prayer, and he takes Jesus' words about the Sabbath and he twists them, where he says, the church was made for me and not I for the church. In other words, with his pigs, his geese, and everything else, the church was made so he could live in comfort. And it's a really kind of biting satire on what many of the clergy had that day had become. Now, next we find probably the greatest satirist of the era, and that's William Hogarth, who was of the Church of England. And he combines morality and humor, which really is the ideal satiric form. When these two come together, we realize we have a satire because he's trying to change people's opinions. Here he's painting his own comic muse, the inspiration for all of his art that's going to come. He said, "My picture was my stage, and men and women my actors." And so basically borrowing from Shakespeare, he creates his own little comedies and dramas throughout his paintings. What is interesting is that an X-ray analysis of his painting originally had a small dog relieving himself on a pile of old master paintings. And so people were saying that his cartoons and engravings and lithographs were not really art. And he is kind of taunting them and poking the bear of the great masters. Now, next we find one of his famous ones, and that's the Sleeping Congregation. And in it again, you find one of the vicars standing high in his pulpit, reading one of his own sermons. Well, one of the deacons is looking leeringly at the young woman whose bodice is quite exposed. But the whole congregation, from the balcony down below, are there, and they are fast asleep. And so he's taking as his text the passage from Jesus says, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And so the irony of Jesus' words happen when you go to a church and the sermon is so long. Thomas Rowlandson, whom we'd met before, we see next in his version of a sleepy congregation. And here he has put both men and women, mostly kind of who have overeaten and are very privileged. They're sitting in front of him, even as he yells at them, which gave rise to the aphorism, "Preaching is talking in someone else's sleep." Be careful you do not preach. Next, we find another series of Hogarth's kind of satires on the Methodists. And here he deals with enthusiasms. And as you may remember, enthusiasm means en theos, in God. And so true enthusiasm is when you have had a taste of God, when you know God, when God has invaded your life, and it can be good. But for the Anglicans of the day, the Methodists were a little excessive in their zeal. And in this famous engraving called Credulity, Superstitious, and Fanaticism, we find a variety of kind of tropes and images in this one kind of dense engraving that you can look at and study for weeks. We find a preacher like George Whitefield, one of the friends and comrades of John Wesley, standing in the pulpit, using the idea of Satan and witches and supernatural things. We find around the pulpit all these images of ghosts from Hamlet and others. But while this is going on, we find a woman giving birth to rabbits, one of the great kind of fictions of the day. We find that other people are kind of smoking. And then we find a man and a woman who he is titillating her with a barometer down her bodice as well. And on the far right, you're going to see what is known as a spiritual barometer. And if we go next, we can see it even a little closer. And in that barometer, you can see that everything runs from madness down to kind of lukewarmness. And there are little devils you can see whispering in people's ears. And there are scripts and little comments all over. In fact, if you look next, we can find that on this howling dog, we have a collar that says Whitefield. George Whitefield, the very famous evangelist who came to the United States, was a friend of Benjamin Franklin, but he would go to the fields and speak out there much like a dog. And so you find even above the dog's head, there's a hymn by George Whitefield. And if you look very closely at the other painting, you can see looking in the window is a Muslim, is a Turk. And so all of these things are coming together to kind of create this amazing kind of critique of what is going on. In fact, next, we look very closely at what were known as the barometers of spiritual health, where people would look to see how good of a Christian am I? How am I feeling? Am I feeling like a Christian? And a Christian is not one who feels like a Christian. A Christian is one who believes in the truth of the gospel. in the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. But here people would look at themselves and see how they were feeling. You also have on the right what is known as the scale of vociferation. The vociferation means how loud can you get? And it's very much like me getting loud at the computer, yelling at the computer. And you can go from kind of a natural tone to a bull roar, where George Whitefield used to say, blood, blood, blood. And this loud voice to kind of get across his sermons were there. On the left of this image, you find that you again have this idea from suicide and depression on the bottom of your enthusiasm, where your feelings are so negative and so melancholic that you move up through despair and agony to lust, ecstasy, madness. And so all of these things come together if you're just evaluating yourself on your feelings. Next, one of my favorite images is the mischief of Methodism, again by Mustard Woodward. And here the Methodist is saying, when I preach, tradesmen forsake their shops, lawyers their clientele, and physicians their sick. In other words, he's saying that people come to hear him. The Anglican responds, when I preach, everyone minds his own business. And so the Anglican has no impact whatsoever on his whole congregation. What is interesting, again, what Woodard does is if you look in the background, you see a lot of other kind of paintings that are referring to aspects of these two religions. The Tale of the Tub goes back to Jonathan Swift on the top left. And this really deals to the kind of the rambling, nonsensical nature of the Methodist sermons. Next painting, his hat hangs over an image of the blind leading the blind. And so here we're kind of dealing with the problems of Methodists, sometimes their enthusiasm, leading them from scripture to just experience. Then third, we find the Anglican's hat obscures a painting called Hope. And then finally, on the last right, we find that there are four evangelists. And the four evangelists suggest an uncharitable contrast between those men who wrote the Gospels and their modern counterparts. And so Woodard is saying, look how far we've come from what is good and right. And next you see kind of a close-up of this really devastating satire on all of this, where you can look closely and see the Tale of the Tub, you can see Hope, and you can see the four Gospels. Next, another great satire that made the rounds was the satire of George Whitefield himself. Now, George Whitefield had problems with his eyesight, and so he squinted. So many called him Dr. Squintum. And in this public engraving, we find that it's attacking his idea of fame. He was famous, not that he drew fame to himself. He wasn't as corrupt as, say, as many televangelists decades ago, but people knew who he was. In fact, probably more people knew him and had seen him than almost anyone else during his era. Wealth, money would come in, but he would take that wealth and start orphanages and sex. Women were drawn to the charisma, to the enthusiasm of George Whitefield, and it was something that he had to beware. Next, we find Thomas Rowlandson again takes us back to the idea of feeling or enthusiasm. Many people who wanted to experience God were called men and women of feeling. And so here he takes this and he puns with it. He shows a man of feeling, a vicar, coming upon a maid with the church in the far background, and he's feeling her up. And so too, the other kind of clergyman sitting beside his fire while the tea is boiling, and he is a man of feeling. Next, we find that George Cruikshank, another great cartoonist or engraver of the 19th century, kind of creates the wild sense of an interior view of the house of God. And we're finding that what we saw last week in the images of revival, of all kinds of corrupt business going on, all kinds of romance and erotic kind of couplings going on, the same thing is happening here. But what is even greater here is that tickets are for sale. If you want a pew in heaven, you've got to come and pay your money now. And so it's saying basically that the church has become a church of mammon, not a church of God. Now, one of my next and my most favorite kind of cartoons from the time is Richard Newton's A Clerical Alphabet. We go from A through Z, and he has kind of little couplets that come and show us what clergy are like and all the varieties of clergy. Because generally, as you remember, the first son received the inheritance, the primogeniture of his father, and so everything would come to him. The second son was sent off to study theology, whether he liked it or not. And it was often just really something they didn't want to do. But what we find next is this wonderful kind of alphabet. And you look, A was archbishop with a red face, probably because he drank too much red wine and ate too much red beef. B was a bishop who longed for his place. He wants to become the archbishop, so we see a little envy. C was for curate, a poor sans-culotte. And the sans-culotte basically are knee breeches. That's all he could wear because he's so poor and such a commoner. D was for dean, who refused him a coat, even grudged him small beer to moisten his throat. And so you have this wonderful kind of sense of satire through all the different positions, all the different characters you would find in the Church of England out there. Next, we come and we see a divine in his glory of how attention was shown to clergy. And not all clergy were bad, but many of them were and took advantage of their position. Next, we find Richard Newton's very comic, "Which way shall I turn me?" Because the parson here is torn between pleasures of the flesh and pleasures of the flesh. So basically, which pleasure of the flesh shall I choose? Shall I choose the luxury and the lasciviousness of the maid on the couch or the sofa? Or shall I choose the food and the wine on the table? And you can see with his eyes and his girth which pleasure he is going to choose. Now, there were others who we see next who began to kind of critique with poetry a lot of the kind of use of religion. And Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote several poems that are just really delightful, but they're basically about marriage. And the first one, Giles Hope, "What? Rise again with all one's bones?" quoth Giles. "I hope you fib. I trusted when I went to heaven to go without my rib." In other words, he doesn't want to take his wife. And so this kind of common laughter about men and women. And then he moves on to Job's luck. "Sly Beelzebub took all occasions to try Job's constancy and patience. He took his honors, took his health. He took his children, took his wealth, his camels, horses, asses, cows, and the sly devil did not take his spouse. But heaven that brings out good from evil and loves to disappoint the devil had predetermined to restore twofold all Job had before. His children, camels, horses, cows, short-sighted devil, not to take his spouse." In other words, in heaven, he would have had several spouses, poor guy. Coleridge goes on next, and he has a friend, Humphrey Davy. And Humphrey Davy was a chemist, and he's the future president of the Royal Society. And he began some experimentation, self-experimentation, very radical for the day, to determine the effects of another drug called nitrous oxide. Now, Coleridge, of course, was addicted for a while to opium. But it's when they got together and they discovered laughing gas. And they would actually have laughing gas. And you can find that here is a prescription for scolding wives, for wives who kind of tell you what you need to do. Just deliver some laughing gas to them, and they'll be laughing so hilariously that you won't have to worry about their scolding. One last poem, the next one that we have on Coleridge, is The Devil's Thoughts, who gets to a different topic. "The devil saw a lawyer killing a viper on a dunghill hard by his own stable, and the devil smiled, for it put him in mind of Cain and his brother Abel." Jokes about lawyers go back to the 19th and 18th century, which is fun. Now, next we get to a good clergyman, finally, someone who is noble, someone who brings laughter, restores and redeems it. And this is the wonderful Anglican Reverend Sidney Smith. And he's the one who gave us the phrase, "a square peg in a round hole." And he was describing himself. But he was one of the funniest and most delightful 19th century vicars that we could find anywhere. He is the one who also tells us the kind of the role of satire or humor and wit in his sermons. He wrote, "Let onions' atoms lurk within the bowl, and, scarce suspected, animate the whole." In other words, you want your wit not to be so obvious, but to be subtle, and so that people, when they think of it, will realize this is quite tasty. There is something like an onion in here which whets my appetite and makes me think. Now, next, people found that ears would perk up when anyone said, well, as Sidney Smith said. Some of the things he said. He said, men worship at the lips of bogus solemnity. When someone acts very seriously, you think, oh, they must know the truth. In fact, next week when we look at C.S. Lewis, we'll find that Lewis thought there was too much holy solemnity about things. There were too many people who felt themselves righteous, and the lower their voice became, the more righteous and holy they were. Not so Sidney Smith, because he saw the role of wit and humor of the parson. He also he said, when a young clergyman asked the canon of St. Paul how he had liked his sermon, Smith, who was the canon of St. Paul's, responded, that, if you must know, I like you better in the bottle than in the barrel. In other words, I like you in small doses rather than being flooded with a whole barrel of beer. And I like beer, but this is not good beer. And then another woman came to him and trying to test his tolerance, she asked Smith if he would refuse to bury a rabid dissenter in an Anglican cemetery. And he said, on the contrary, madam, I would be only too glad to bury them all. And so in his indirect communication, he plays on everyone. And he said, what a pity it is that the only amusements in England are vice and religion. Next, we find one of his great lines. He said, thank God for tea. What would the world do without tea? How did it exist? I am glad I was not born before tea. He moved on to look at some of his congregation, and there were women who would wear all their finery, as we see in this image next. She looked as if she had walked straight out of an ark, he said. And we have archbishops or bishops who may look like that. And then he looked at preaching himself. He says, preaching has become a byword for long and dull conversation of any kind. And whoever wishes to imply in any piece of writing the absence of everything agreeable and inviting calls it a sermon. But next, when he got to dealing with sex, he says, as the French say, there are three sexes, men, women, and clergymen. And clergymen were, to be, at least in his opinion, quite celibate. And he pondered the problem of how a bachelor bishop could ever get married. He said, how can I flirt? The most I can say is, I will meet you in the vestry after the service. And so he never had sex there in quite a while, and they turned into frogs. Next, we find another great author, Anthony Trollope, who was the master of the mock epic, this kind of great story about little things. In his Barchester Towers, he deals with Anglican clergy as spiritual bureaucrats. There's a tendency of people in churches to become bureaucrats instead of the living church of Christ. And yet in his satire, he recognized the satirist who writes nothing but satire should write but little, or it will seem that his satire springs rather from his own caustic and sarcastic nature than from the sins of the world in which he lives. Now, people enjoyed Trollope very much in the 19th century. In fact, the woman who could not be amused, Queen Victoria, said about his writing, I like Barchester Towers very much. It makes one laugh till one cries. It is so very true. But I think it mischievous and rather wicked. Next, we find in his mock epics, he is trying to show people how to live a good life in a wicked world. And sin invades the church as much as it does the pub. Next, he says, the Church of England is the only church in the world that interferes neither with your politics nor with your religion. They just let you be. They are so tolerant of everything that they stand for nothing. Next, we find that his characters are just basically concerned with trivial pursuits, tiny disputes. It's the little things which irritate them, annoy them, and they begin to kind of let those things mushroom into major problems when they're so insignificant in the whole understanding of life. In fact, next we find that when the elderly bishop dies in Barchester Towers, most people think that his son, the archdeacon, will succeed him. But there are a lot of politics going on conspiring that to prevent it from happening. So the bishop's replacement is the ineffectual but a very nice man, Mr. Proudie. His ball-busting wife, who wants to kind of scold everybody and take over, and his slimy assistant, Chaplain Mr. Obadiah Slope, who is one of the most off-putting characters in literature. Simultaneously, an ass-kissing smarm machine, an insufferable educator, and an overbearing, arrogant schemer. In fact, you find next in the novel that Signora Neroni uses her kind of feminine wiles on him to get what she wants. What's really fun about the kind of the TV series is that Alan Rickman plays the slimy Obadiah Slope. So from Slope to Snape, it's just a wonderful kind of transition. But he's very much, if we look next, at somewhat of a Tartuffe. And he attacks others because he keeps this little notebook that he's always consulting. He has every sin noted. Now, we all probably need a friend like that. And every time we sin, he writes it down and he brings it back to our memory. You could have someone like Slope, or you could have a wife who doesn't forget. Now, mine does forget very well. But he doesn't hesitate to bring anything out of it when he needs to win a fight. And one of his quotes in the book is, "Allow me to further humiliate you with facts from my handy notebook." Next, we find Madeline says, I've sinned. Tell me I've forgiven. And Obadiah, who wants to seduce her, says, well, what is there to forgive? Next, she says, forgive me for telling the truth, and let us still be friends, because she has mocked him twice more for true forgiveness. What we find next is in all these stories, as Trollope says, there is no happiness in love except at the end of an English novel. And so it's a very playful kind of panacea for suffering. If you are suffering during the pandemic, pick up Anthony Trollope in Barchester Towers. Next, we find one of his great quotes coming from this, and he gets back to the theme we've seen here today. He says, only preachers have the power to compel an audience to sit silent and be tormented. But no one can rid himself of the preaching clergyman. He is the bore of the age, the old man whom we Sinbads cannot shake off, the nightmare that disturbs our Sunday rest, the incubus that overloads our religion and makes God's service distasteful. Preachers do not realize that when they speak for a long time, have such a deleterious effect on our spiritual growth. But Trollope next gave us one little memory. He said, what on earth could be more luxurious than a sofa, a book, and a cup of coffee? Was anything so civil? Next, we move to Punch. And Punch magazine was the satire magazine of the 18th century and 19th century. In fact, C.S. Lewis grew up reading all of his father's Punch magazines when he was a young boy. And next we find different cartoons, such as Sunday Music as Cant would have it. Now, Cant refers both to the Archbishop of Canterbury and Cant meaning hypocrisy. And so here we find an evangelical with a tract in his pocket. But on the right, we have a Puritan with a liquor bottle in his pocket. And they're basically just blowing their own noses. And the Church of England, many of them had gone to Oxford and Cambridge, beating on what looks like a beer barrel. And so he's mocking both the Church of England and the different kind of dissenters. In the next satire, we find that the Church of England is trying to get ritualists out of its church and send them back to Rome. And so you had the Oxford movement of Cardinal Henry Newman moving to the Roman Catholic Church because he saw them as pure rather than what the Anglican Church had become. And the next cartoon by the famous cartoonist John Tenniel is a Pan-Anglican washing day, where all the rationalism, all the dullness, all the deism of the Anglican Church is trying to be brought to the Church of England's missions. He says, there's so much that I need to watch. It's in my church. If we move to more recent Punch cartoons next, we find a character in the stained glass sanctuary asking, as if Sunday isn't enough, he now wants us to introduce religion into our everyday life. God is for Sunday, according to these men. Or one of my more enjoyable cartoons is next, when you have a character in a courtroom. He says, funny, I always picture Judgment Day with the Lord in majestic robes standing on a promontory high above a valley, undulating with all those cringing, frightened peoples of the earth. But here we have Judgment Day as a courtroom. We get next to the last two characters we're going to look at. And the first is Hilaire Belloc. Hilaire Belloc, whatever his name was mentioned at a Monty Python concert or performance, Monty Python fans would erupt in laughter. Hilaire Belloc, ha 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 ha. Next, we find that he has these ironic asides on modernity, on everything that's modern that's going to save us. And so he mocks kind of this false science. And he writes, life is a veil. Its paths are dark and rough, only because we do not know enough. When science has discovered something more, we shall be happier than we were before. Belloc is telling us all the science in the world has not made us one iota happier. People suffer and even suffer more because of science. Now, what he did do next was write some wonderful children's literature that I used to kind of make my children a little bit of little dark kids that I have. Rebecca, who slammed doors for fun and perished miserably. They're kind of cautionary tales that you find like with Grimm's fairy tales. It happened that a marble bust of Abraham was standing just above the door. The little lamb had carefully prepared to slam and knock it down, and down it came. It knocked her flat. It laid her out. She looked like that. Her funeral sermon, which was long and followed by a sacred song, mentioned his virtues, it is true, but dwelt upon her vices too, and showed the dreadful end of one who goes and slams the door for fun. And so Belloc really takes all of these annoying things that children do and tries to scare them into good behavior. In fact, next we find his little parable on George, who played with a dangerous toy and suffered a catastrophe of considerable dimensions when his immense balloon blows up and explodes. Or next, there's Matilda, who told lies and was burned to death. And so all of these extreme examples are not to be given to children who are under 8. Next, we find, though, that it is Belloc who chronicled his path to Rome and how faith for him was not taught, but it was something that was breathed in. It was inhaled. It inhabited him. It came to him. And what he found about the fellowship of the Roman Catholic Church was, he says, wherever the Catholic sun does shine, there's love and laughter and good red wine. His last line was, when I am dead, I hope it may be said, this is next, when I am dead, I hope it may be said, his sins were scarlet, but his books were red. Next, he became known as a character called the Chester Belloc. George Bernard Shaw said, this is a very amusing pantomime elephant where you get these two big guys together. And what we find next is they had quite a few debates. They were beloved enemies. Shaw believed in the life force. Belloc and Chesterton believed in the Roman Catholic faith. And as Chesterton wrote, he says, we make our friends, we make our enemies, but God makes our next door neighbor. And we're called to love our neighbor. Now, next we find that there were debates between Chesterton and Shaw on the public stages. And Chesterton, who was about 350 pounds, and Shaw was a puny, emaciated little author, would get on there. In fact, Chesterton would once say to Shaw, some would say that there is a famine in England by the look of you. And Shaw would retort, well, by the look of you, you were the cause of it. Or they would say, and Shaw would look at him and say, and mock him and say, when the child is born, Gilbert, because you're so large, what are you going to name it? And Chesterton would say, if it is a boy, I shall name him John. If it's a girl, I shall call her Mary. But if it is gas, I shall call it George Bernard Shaw. And so they had this very friendly kind of battle that would take place where their ideas would be exchanged and they would kind of explore things. Now, next we get to our last person of the day, and that's G.K. Chesterton, Gilbert Keith Chesterton, who has been cited by U2 and by Calvin and Hobbes and by so many others. Next, we find that Chesterton grew up in a very liberal agnostic age during freethinkers, and the belief in progress was almost an established church. People thought that men and women are getting better, and therefore we're going to become better people. But as he grew up, he became aware of life itself, and he was grateful for every day that he could get up and breathe and enjoy his food, his wine, his friends, his wife. He realized that someone must have given him that gift of life, and it was the Lord. So next he became a Fleet Street journalist in London. He said, basically mocked his own profession. He said, journalism largely consists of saying, Lord Jones is dead, to people who never knew that Lord Jones was alive. But next we find that he wrote for the Illustrated London News. He had a column almost every week that was full of wit and gladness, and people would read his columns before anything else. Next, he had one of his great quotes, I've searched all the parks in the cities, and I've never found a statue of a committee. And so here we find that it is only men that you have to kind of decapitate. Committees are too boring to deal with. Next, he wrote that once I planned to write a book of poems entirely about the things I found in my pockets. But I found that it was too long and the age of great epics is past. His pockets were like a woman's purse, and who knew what you could find in his stuffed pockets? Next, he met, loved, and married the diminutive Frances Boggs, a wonderful, reasonable, intelligent, and careful woman and caring woman. In fact, next, Chesterton often forgot where he was supposed to be. And so once he sent a telegram to his wife, am at Market Harborough. Where ought I to be? To which she replied, home. Come home, Gilbert. Next, we find that he rejected modern Anglicanism because bishops were willing to bend the doctrines in the name of Christian unity. They did not hold on to orthodoxy, straight thinking. Out of gratitude, he actually built a chapel in his hometown from the profits of all of his books. But next, we find that the fruit of this fat saint was in his road to Rome. And when a journalist asked him, why did you join the Church of Rome? He said simply, to get rid of my sins. Only here could I hear the word of Christ that would forgive me for everything that I am and do. Next, we find that he becomes a champion of orthodoxy. And there's a fellow Roman Catholic, Ronald Knox, who C.S. Lewis says was the wittiest man alive in England during the 20s and 30s. In fact, Knox wrote that it was diet, not dogma, that divided the Episcopals, the Roman Catholics, from Muslims and Hindus and everyone else. He says they were willing to give up their doctrines because for unity, to be ecumenical. But the problem came when the Muslims and the Hindus said you cannot eat the flesh of a pig or cow, and you could not drink fermented liquors. To which the English finally said, we will never compromise on bacon, beef, and beer. Those are much more important than anything about Christ and the Gospels. Next, we come to his humility. And asked by another journalism, what's wrong with the world? Chesterton replied, dear sirs, I am. Sincerely yours. This is the base problem for all of us. When we recognize we are the problem of the world, that if we could change ourselves and become loving neighbors, loving enemies, loving friends, then perhaps things would change just a bit. Next, we go through a whole series of his quotes. The first two facts he wrote, which a healthy boy or girl feels about sex, are these. First, that it is beautiful and fascinating, and then that it is dangerous. The word good, he wrote, has many meanings. For example, if a man were to shoot his grandmother at a range of 500 yards, I should call him a good shot, but not necessarily a good man. And then his famous aphorism, the Bible tells us to love our enemies and also to love our neighbors and also our enemies, probably because they are generally the same people. Next, he wrote, the best way to catch a train is to miss the one that comes before it. Don't worry about missing life. Everything is going to come around, and just enjoy the fact that you're late. Now, next, he recommended to people that they dawdle or they doodle, particularly when listening to a lecture like now, because what science has shown us is that doodling works on your mind to help you retain even more. And so here are two of his cartoons. He shows the just indignation of Queen Victoria, or King Charles I going off his head when the Puritans cut it off. Or my favorite is next. He said, how I felt when I went to Ireland and I met the great, great Saint Patrick. And Patrick just looms as a giant before this jolly fat man. Now, next we find he wrote even on other saints, on St. Thomas Aquinas, whom he called the dumb ox, or on St. Francis of Assisi called the clown of God. And he got to the essence of who these saints were, and he showed how unique each one of us is. But he also saw in their lives, he says, it's the test of a good religion, whether you can joke about it, whether you can laugh in the presence of God. If you can't, you may have a false religion. In fact, next he said that God's truth can be expressed in long sentences or in short jokes. In fact, once when he was getting out of a taxi, he was having difficulty getting out because of his girth. And a woman said, why don't you try to get out sideways? And he responded, ma'am, I have no sideways. This is all I am. Next, we go through a few other quick little axioms that he gave us. A yawn is a silent shout. If someone is yawning in your presence, they're yelling for help. An inconvenience is an adventure wrongly considered. When something puts you off, realize that you have just gotten into a wild adventure. You are in Jumanji. You don't know what's going to happen, and you must enjoy it. Or, I regard golf as an expensive way of playing marbles. And what I have done with all my books is followed his wisdom. If a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. Welcome to these lectures. But next we find that he wrote so many other books, All Things Considered, which you may know from NPR, or this great oxymoron, Tremendous Trifles. Or he tells us, without education, we are in horrible and deadly danger of taking educated people seriously. If you can't laugh at your professors, if you can't doodle when they're speaking, you are in trouble. We find next that Neil Gaiman, the great fantasy writer, has a character, in his Sandman series, whose name is Gilbert. And in Good Omens, he dedicated it to GKC. He said, a man who knew what was going on. Now, Chesterton played next at writing Clerihews. One of his friends named Edmund Clerihew Bentley kind of created these little poems that were there. And they're short biographical humorous verses with AABB format. We'll get to it in a second. For example, it was a weakness of Voltaire's never to say his prayers, and one to which his shame he never overcame. Or, with the cartoon on the left, he wrote, the people of Spain think Cervantes equal to half a dozen Dantes, an opinion resented most bitterly by all the people of Italy. Next we see, here's the form. There are 4 lines long. The first and the second lines rhyme with each other. The third and the fourth lines rhyme with each other. The first line names a person, and the second line rhymes with that name. It should be funny. And so the essence is the art of biography is different from geography. Geography is about maps, but biography is about chaps. Let's go next to a common Clara Hugh. Father Brown, he wrote the whole Father Brown series, G.K. Chesterton. Father Brown gained wide renown, not for prayer books or hymnals, but for collaring criminals. Now, what I want to do next is encourage you to write your own Clara Hugh. And here's one that I wrote. Terry Lindvall, who wasn't tall, caught a wife that stretched his life. She was 5'10", I was 5'5". I am still. Maybe I'm shrinking. But she made my life much better and much longer. Next, we come to what he saw in the vitality of children. He said, children remain young. God is eternally young, but we get old. And children enjoy monotony. They enjoy doing the same things over and over again. One of their great lines is, do it again, or read it again. And so every morning when the sun comes up, God claps his hand in glee and says, do it again. That was wonderful. Enjoy these simple things of life. Next, we go through his Father Brown series. And Sherlock Holmes had his deduction, his rationality. But Father Brown had this intuition into what human nature was really like. He said he could identify with the sinner. He could understand the sinner because he understood what the temptation to sin was. In 1954, we find next, Robert Hammer did a film on Father Brown. And it starred Alec Guinness, whom we see here. In fact, next, you find the story about while on location in France, they were filming the Father Brown movie, and Alec Guinness was approached by a young French boy who, seen in costume, exclaimed, mon père, and hanged onto his arm and chatted away with the French. Eventually, the boy said goodbye and left. And Guinness was amazed and impressed that the cassock of a priest could inspire such trust and happiness and joy in a child for a complete stranger. And so Guinness started to investigate the Christian faith and subsequently joined the Roman Catholic Church because of this joyous encounter with a young boy. And so what we find next is Guinness takes the wisdom of Father Brown, and he even becomes Obi-Wan Kenobi, that we all know. Next, we come to the great existentialist Franz Kafka. And when he read Chesterton, it moved him. He wrote, he is so joyous, one might almost believe he had found God. And so the man that found such desperation in human existence, when he read Chesterton, knew that there was something else. And Chesterton always wrote that joy is the secret of the Christian life, that when you know Christ, you know joy. Next, we find that Chesterton has even had its influence on Wallace and Gromit and all of Aardman's animation, that he could be made into a delightful clay animation himself. But next, we end with what is coming next week. And that's C.S. Lewis, who read G.K. Chesterton when he was an atheist. Chesterton once wrote, if there were no God, there would be no atheists. An atheist needs a God. And Lewis basically tells us, I am very evidence of that very truth. Because in his 20s, when he was an atheist and a Freudian and a would-be poet, he read Chesterton. And he said Chesterton was the sanest man alive apart from his Christianity. But the more he read him and George MacDonald and Edmund Spencer and so many others, he realized the truth of the Christian life, until people like Hugh Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien would introduce him to the God who died and came back to life. Next week, for our last lecture, we're going to look at C.S. Lewis and American comic Stephen Colbert and find their similarities and differences. Until then, God be with you.